Hey, what's up, everybody? It's Joey. I wanted to let you know that this sermon you're about to listen to is another installment in our Story of God series. This is the series that we pick up a couple of times a year, walking through the great story of the Bible. We did create a separate podcast feed for all of our Story of God messages so that they can all be found conveniently in one place. And if you want to find that, I will link it in the episode description here for you. I hope you're blessed by this message. Grace and peace be with you. We are jumping back in to our mega series this morning, and that's what I call it because I don't have a better word, the story of God. How many of you remember or have been here for any of the story of God sermons so far? Yeah? All right, so these messages that we're jumping into here on Joseph, believe it or not, will be the 19th and 20th sermons on the book of Genesis. Lots of messages. Now, the thing is, we've been spacing them out every so often. We jump back in and we pick up the story. So a very, very long time ago, we did 6 weeks on creation, the fall, Cain and Abel, Noah, the Tower of Babel. And then a little while later, we picked up the story with Abraham and Isaac. We did 6 weeks there. And then earlier in the year, we did 6 weeks on Jacob. And so the thing is, if I don't hurry this thing up, Zachariah's kids are going to have to finish the series in like 2085 or something like that. We will all be gone and the story will still be happening. You know, we'll be like in Judges somewhere and, you know, Zachariah will just be going on faithfully, you know. But we are picking up the story every so often. I got big plans for next year. We're going to jump into some Exodus stuff in February. We're going to do 3 installments in the series next year so we can get this thing wrapped up before I have to retire. And so we're going to pick up speed. But we got 2 weeks here on Joseph. 2 weeks here. Now, why do we do this series? Why do we do it? The reason we do it is because you and I are living as part of this big story that God is telling with the world. And if we're not careful, we get so sucked into our own individual stories. Our own stories where you're the main character and I'm the main character. We get caught up in what's happening in my life, what's happening to me, what am I called to. And if we're not careful, we end up with a very self-centered gospel and a very self-centered spiritual formation. And yet there's a bigger story to your story. There's a bigger story to what's happening in our city. There's a bigger story to what's happening in our nation. We talked about that with the politics series. There's a bigger story than America. It's the story of God's world. And so when we come to the text of Scripture, we're not reading random fables. We're not reading random myths. Actually, the Bible is the true story of God, of the world, and everything and everyone in it. And so if you want to find your calling from God, your destiny, your identity, you won't find it by getting alone in a vacuum somewhere and maybe God will just zap you with something. Those things are part of it. But what you will really find, if you really want to find your destiny, is that you got to find your place in this big story. You got to find your place in this story that God is telling with the world. Leslie Newbegin says, if the biblical story does not control our thinking, then we will be swept into the story that the world tells about itself. We'll get swept up into my story or the story of this city or this nation, and yet God is inviting us into his story. Now, I will say this here, since these episodes, these messages, these series have been so spaced out that we made a separate podcast feed just for the Story of God series. And so if you type in City Alive Church, Story of God, you'll see 18 messages on Genesis. So get caught up by next week. That's homework there. There'll be a test next week. To give you a little bit of recap, though, in the beginning, God, our good God, made a good world. And because he's a good God, he only makes good things, believe it or not. And this God who made a good world full of life and beauty and order and goodness, in the middle of that world, as the crown of his creation, he puts a man and a woman, and he blesses them, and he says, be fruitful, multiply, fill the earth and subdue it. But Adam and Eve were the first priests and kings on the earth. God said, let them have dominion. And so he raises up Adam and Eve to be his image bearers, to be his likeness for the world, that the whole world could look at these human beings and they could see what God is like. And that's why the Jewish people, they didn't have images or idols of their gods. God said, don't make any carved images of anything. And it sounds weird if you were an ancient person and you asked a Jew, you would say, well, what does your God look like? Where's the statue? Where's the idol? And yet the reason this God doesn't have any images of himself in wood or stone or gold is because God has already stamped his likeness all over the world. And it's you and it's me, made in his image and likeness. Now, it didn't take us long to get the story off track. Genesis 3, in the garden, Adam and Eve choose to give their authority to the serpent. And the irony, of course, is that God said in Genesis 1 that they had authority over all the animals, the beasts of the field, every creeping thing that creeps on the earth. How many of you know we have authority over the creeps? Come on, in Jesus' name. Come on, somebody. We have authority from the Lord. And yet when the serpent, when the beast comes into the garden, instead of driving out that unclean spirit, instead they hand their leadership to it. And so the world is in bondage to the enemy. The world is in bondage to sin. And so through the stories of Cain and Abel, Noah, the Tower of Babel, the world over and over and over again is falling into sin. So in Genesis 12, I know this is a lot of setup here. Stay with me. Genesis 12, the story of God takes a massive turn. God calls a man named Abram, who he renames Abraham, and the rest of the Bible, the rest of it, Genesis 1 through 11 is these global events. Genesis 12, the rest of the Bible is about this guy named Abraham and his family. And God says to him, through your family, I will bless the world. I'm going to give you a land, and that land is going to be blessed. I'm going to give you a nation out of your descendants, and they're going to be blessed. But you see, the blessing for you, Abraham, it's not just for you, it's through you to the world. That the blessing that's on your life, it's actually not about you. It's about the blessing of God moving through you, so all the nations will be blessed. Now, the funny thing about that is, Abraham is a very old man who doesn't have a single child. And we talked about this miraculous birth of Isaac, who's a result of the impossible supernatural power of God to bring life out of dead places. And Isaac has Jacob and Esau, and we talked about that earlier this year. And so where we're picking up the story is, Jacob, who was with his uncle Laban, comes home not with one wife, but with two. And we talked about how messed up all of that was in our Jacob series. He's got 12 sons, and he comes back home. He's back in the land promised to his father and grandfather. And now we're going to pick up with Joseph here. So I know that was a lot. Genesis 37. And instead of following along in the Word, I'd like to ask you to follow along on the screen today because we're going to be skipping around a little bit because we have so much here. The theme of Joseph, if I could give you Joseph in a sentence, and it's a lot of chapters, from Genesis 37 through 50, almost all of it's about Joseph. Here's my sentence of this is Joseph. It's that God uses a suffering Savior to rescue his people. That's Joseph. So Genesis 37:3 says this. Now Israel, this is Jacob renamed Israel. Israel loved Joseph more than his other sons because Joseph was a son born to him in his old age. And he made an ornate robe for him. When his brothers saw that their father loved him more than all his brothers, they hated him and could not bring themselves to speak peaceably to him. Then Joseph had a dream. When he told it to his brothers, they hated him even more. He said to them, "Listen to this dream I had. There we were, binding sheaves of grain in the field. Suddenly my sheaf stood up, and your sheaves gathered around to it and bowed down to my sheaf." I could tell you, if I told that dream to my brothers, that would go over about as well as it's going to go for Joseph. "Are you really going to reign over us?" his brothers asked him. "Are you really going to rule us?" So they hated him even more because of his dream and what he had said. Then he had another dream and told it to his brothers. Joseph, come on. The first one, it's around the breakfast table. "Hey guys, I had this dream." Joseph, the second one, this is on you. "Look," he said, "I had another dream, and this time the sun, moon, and 11 stars were bowing down to me." So verse 23, Joseph goes out to the field to catch up with his brothers. And it says they stripped off Joseph's robe, the ornate robe that he had on, and they took him and threw him into the pit. The pit was empty and without water. So they're going to leave him for dead, then they're going to kill him. And then they decide, listen, that's too extreme. Let's just sell him into slavery and go easy on him. So verse 28, when Midianite traders passed by, his brothers pulled Joseph out of the pit and sold him for 20 pieces of silver to the Ishmaelites, who took Joseph to Egypt. And then what happens is they take the robe, the colorful robe, the ornate robe, they kill a goat, dip the robe in its blood, and they say to Jacob, "Your son is gone. He must have been eaten by wild beasts." Now, this whole thing here, this whole wild, crazy story, what you see in it, for those of you who remember some of our Jacob stuff, is that the same patterns are repeating generation to generation. If you remember Jacob and his brother Esau, his parents were playing favorites. Isaac loved Esau. Rebekah loved Jacob. And so you see it again happening here. Parents playing favorites, brothers at war with each other. And an incredible irony, Jacob, who deceived his own father, is now deceived by his sons. And so you see this pattern of dysfunction, this pattern of brokenness. And what I want you to see in this whole Story of God series is that God is really good at using messed up people and messed up families to accomplish his plan for the world. And that's really good for your family. I would say my family, but they're in the room, so they're pretty much perfect. God is really good at using broken, dysfunctional, messed up families. Jacob here has 2 wives who are sisters. It's against the Bible. The sisters are in this baby-making competition because they're trying to win Jacob's love. They give their servants to Jacob, so there's 12 sons, 4 women. They're fighting. Joseph almost gets killed. And this, you have to remember, this is the entire people of God. This is not like, well, Joey, there's 2 billion Christians in the world. This is like, Joey, where are God's people where are they on earth in Genesis 37? There's a few dozen of them, and it's these people. This is the whole plan. Hey, Abraham, you're going to bless nations. I don't actually have any kids. Okay, here's one. His name's Isaac. Great. All right, we got one. On our way to changing the world. Isaac grows up, has 2. They're at each other's throats. Goes to Jacob. Now look at this mess. And it's like, God, where are you in any of this? Where are you in this whole messed up family, this whole messed up situation? And this is the beauty of the Bible, is that God's the only hero. God's the only savior. And guess what? If you don't feel like you're good enough, get in line. I'm not either. But you see, the beauty is that he's good enough for all of us. And he's really good at using imperfect people, because that's the only kind of people there are. This family's going to change the world? Yeah, this is it. I love them. I'm wild about them. You read the Old Testament and it's like, I'm the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And it's like, have you seen them? This Jacob? This Abraham? And God's like, yeah, I'm crazy about them. Listen, if you ever think the church is nuts, it is, but God is wild about it. Joseph here, he has a dream. And listen, if I told my brothers twice I had dreams, they were bowing down to me, Danny's in the back, he'll tell you right now, he would sell me to Ishmaelites right now if I told him that. 20 pieces, cheap, on the dime, just take them off my hands. He's going around with this coat and these dreams, I can't deal with it. It's crazy. And yet dreams in the Bible are often a prophetic sign. Have you had any dreams from God in your life? I'll tell you a story here. I had the opportunity to go on a missions trip to Ethiopia with an evangelist friend of mine. And he had planted a church in the past with this guy named Muhammad, who you can guess was formerly Muslim. And I asked Muhammad, I got to meet him, and he was telling me his story. And I asked him, hey, how'd you come to faith in Jesus? And he said, I grew up fairly radically Muslim. He said, I grew up in Yemen, and I hated Christians. And there's very few Christians in Yemen. And he said, I had this Christian neighbor, this lady. He said, I hated her. And she would try to talk to me about Jesus, and I couldn't stand her. And he said, the thing that made me the most upset was that the more I hated her, the more she loved me. And he said, it made me hate her even more. So he said, one night I had this dream, and in the dream I was fishing. This is like, not like I had a dream like Rapunzel entangled. This is like a sleep dream, okay? Asleep. He said, I had a dream. In the dream I was fishing. And as I was fishing, I'm sitting out in the boat on the water. As I'm pulling in the line, I keep pulling up people into the boat. And he said, I kept having this dream, and I had no idea what it meant. And he said, I talked to my Christian neighbor, because she's always trying to talk to me. I told her my dream. And he said, she opened up to the Gospel of Mark and told me the story where Jesus called Peter and Andrew and James and John. And he told them they'd be fishers of men. He said, I gave my life to Jesus right there in her living room. And now he's an evangelist, catching people for Jesus. That's a dream. Now, I'm not going to say I've had dreams quite that explicit, but as a little aside, if I could just challenge you, be open to the leading of the Spirit in your dreams. Now listen, some dreams, they're nuts. They're crazy. You don't know what they mean. But there's a handful of us here in the church that have had dreams and interpret dreams. So if you got a dream that you think is from the Lord, bring it to me. I'm not saying I always have some crazy interpretation, but there's a few people up here, they'll interpret your dream for you. I guarantee it. Joseph has a dream. And he feels from the Lord like this is something that's real. So what happens here, chapter 39, we're going to start here in verse 1. You'll see it on the screen. Now Joseph had been taken to Egypt. An Egyptian named Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh, and the captain of the guards, bought him from the Ishmaelites who had brought him there. Now notice this, Yahweh, the Lord, was with Joseph, and he became a successful man. serving in the household of his Egyptian master. When his master saw that Yahweh was with him and that Yahweh made everything he did successful, Joseph found favor with his master and became his personal attendant. Potiphar also put him in charge of his household and placed all that he owned under his authority. Now, what happens here, many of you might know the story. Potiphar's wife sees Joseph, says Joseph's well-built and handsome, and she sees him and she says, "Hey, sleep with me." And Joseph says no. She grabs his tunic as he's running away and leaves the tunic behind. And so to save face, she blames it on Joseph and tells her husband, "Look what your slave tried to do." So we're going to pick up here in 19. It says, when his master heard the story, his wife told him that these are the things that your slave did to me. He was furious, and he had him thrown into prison where the king's prisoners were confined. So Joseph was there in prison, and again, look at this. But Yahweh was with Joseph and extended kindness to him. He granted him favor with the prison warden, and the warden put all the prisoners who were in the prison under Joseph's authority. And he was responsible for everything that was done there. The warden did not bother with anything under Joseph's authority because Yahweh was with him, and Yahweh made everything that he did successful. All right, what do you do? What do you do when you have a dream from God? What do you do when you have a word from God? What do you do when there's a clear, God said, you're going to do this? What do you do when you have that from God and then it seems like the exact opposite happens? This is a pattern, again, in the Word. God's like, Abraham, you're going to birth nations. Your descendants will outnumber the stars. And he's like, I don't have a single child. Joseph, you're going to have this dream. The sheaves of wheat, your brothers, they're going to bow down to you. Even the sun, the moon, and the stars are going to bow down to you. And Joseph's like, I got my coat. I got my dream. Check me out. He's thrown into a pit. Then he goes into slavery in Potiphar's house. And then he's in prison. He goes down to the pit, down to Egypt, and down to prison. His life could not get any worse. And this is a very important thing that you need to hear in your life. What we expect as we begin to get our lives right, we're a new believer, we start cleaning some stuff up, and we expect that as we grow in our walk with God, our lives should get progressively better. And we want this linear, step-by-step, I'm here, I'm getting better, onward and upward, and our lives should get better. And the thing about Joseph is that his dream that he had from the Lord made his life worse. Now we're going to see next week the end of the story and how God used all of it. But here's the thing. You have to forget for a minute that you know the end of the story. You have to forget for a minute. Put yourself in Joseph's shoes. The favorite son, got my coat, got my dream. Now I'm in a pit. Now I'm in slavery. And listen, the thing about Joseph here, it's like, man, he worked his way up. If I was in Potiphar's house, I'd have a terrible attitude. There's bad things that have happened to all of us in this room. None of us have ever been sent as a slave to a foreign country. Okay? Not happened. And if that was me, I would have the worst possible attitude imaginable. I'd be going down swinging. You're not getting anything out of me. What do you expect from me? And yet what Joseph does, Joseph serves Potiphar. He serves the man. And what it says is the Lord blessed him. He found favor. He was successful. And here's my challenge to you, church. I wish I could tell you that if you become a follower of Jesus, you will not suffer anymore. I wish I could tell you that. I can't. But what I can invite you to this morning is how to suffer well. Nobody wants to suffer well. We want this linear, progressive life of comfort and ease. And if I'm doing the right things, life should get better. And it seems like the more right Joseph is, the more worse his life gets. Here's a profound lesson in the story of Joseph. You cannot control what happens to you most of the time. And I know no one wants to say amen to that. No one wants to shout to that. No one's going to stand up and run around the room for that. But where I grew up, the pastor used to say all the time, you can't control what happens to you, but you can control your response to what happens to you. And here's the truth. If you live your life basing your happiness on some comfortable circumstances around the corner, you're probably never going to be happy. You got to know this. If your happiness is based on everything going well in your life, you're never going to be happy. Because when you get your finances sorted out, something will happen with your health. When you get your health sorted out, something happens with your family. And I wish I could offer you a comfortable and easy life, and I can't. But what I can promise you is that if you steward what God places in your hands, if you steward the season that's right in front of you, as awful as it is, as terrible as it is, as unjust as it is, the Lord will be with you. You can't control the season of life that you're in, but you can steward what's right in front of you. You can steward it. You can steward it well. You can't control all the stuff out here, but you can control what's in here. You can control what's in here. And here's the thing, not to get to the end of the story, but if you don't steward Potiphar's house well and you don't steward the prison well, you're not going to make it to the palace. That it's what you do in those places when everything's falling apart. It's what you do in those places when you feel like you're forgotten about, everyone's moved on without you. Being faithful in that place is what qualifies you for the promotion. How do you steward it? Joseph, when Potiphar's wife came at him, could have easily said, my brothers are jerks. Look at my life. My life is terrible. I'm a slave. And, I've done some good in Potiphar's house, but, what about my dream? Where's God now? And instead, he chose to be faithful, literally running. And in some commentaries I read this week, this wasn't his nice fancy cloak that he left behind. It was an undergarment, the Hebrew word says. He ran out basically with nothing left but undies, maybe naked. And he fled, he left, he ran. And you see, this is what the enemy does. If he can't get Egypt to corrupt you, he'll throw Potiphar's wife at you. And this is not a sermon about lust, although it could be. It's that in whatever way the enemy wants to come at you, he will. And if he can't get you this way, he'll come at you that way. And yet Joseph set his face to say, I don't care what comes my way. I don't care what my brothers did. I don't care what Potiphar's wife is doing. I'm staying faithful to the Lord in this season of my life. He set his face. And you got to set your face to say, I don't care what anybody around me does. I don't care if they turn their back on me. No matter what the enemy throws my way, I'm going to set my face. I'm going to live right. I'm going to steward this moment. And it's that attitude that positions Joseph for the palace one day. Josh said it in a sermon earlier this year, and it stuck with me. Sometimes obedience to the will of God makes your life worse. Joseph said no to Potiphar's wife. Good job, man. That's what the Bible says to do. What is his reward? Prison. See, in the American church, we want this American gospel, which sounds more like the American dream than the gospel. And it's that our lives will get better if we make the right choices. And sometimes the will of God will cost you something. You've got to be willing to let the will of God cost you something. He could have said, it's easier to be with Potiphar's wife. Everything will be chill. Everything will be fine. Why not enjoy myself? I'm in Egypt after all. God's probably forgotten about me. And yet the truth of the matter is is that this is a crucial moment in Joseph's life. I want you to notice a pattern here. It says 4 things, and you'll see these 4 things on the screen. That number 1, the Lord was with Joseph. Is that up there? You see these 4 things when Joseph gets to Potiphar's house, and then again when he gets to the prison. I was reading it this week, and I'm like, wow, look at this pattern. He's in Potiphar's house, and he's in prison, and what does it say? The Lord was with him. Both times. And then, both times it says, God gave him favor. Anybody want some favor on their life? Favor with the warden, favor with Potiphar. And then it says, he was given authority. It says about Potiphar later on, we didn't read it yet, that the guy literally, he's the captain of Pharaoh's guard. He didn't look at anything because he knew Joseph had it taken care of. The only thing he concerned himself with was what to eat. Literally, he was like, I'll feed myself, Joseph. I got that part. You do everything else. And he did, because Joseph did it well. Same with the warden. I've never heard of a corrections officer handing the keys to a prisoner and being like, actually just run the whole thing because I know you're going to run it super well. You're going to run it better than I would. Authority and then success. Both times, both cases, success. Here, this is crazy. His life looks like anything but success. But here's what you got to see. You cannot control the external circumstances of life, but you can be victorious in the midst of whatever's in front of you. I want to be the kind of person that, like, whether I'm in my Father's house as the beloved son, sorry, Danny, just kidding. Whether I'm in my Father's house or I'm in prison, I'm going to be thriving by the grace of God. It says here in verse 21, Yahweh was with Joseph and extended kindness to him. That word kindness is the Hebrew word hesed. And this word, you have to know this word. It is probably one of the most important Hebrew words in the entire Old Testament. Now, 9 times out of 10, when someone says, well, this is the Greek or this is the Hebrew, don't worry about it. It just means the same thing. Like door means door. There's no magic there. Nothing special. But sometimes, and anybody who's bilingual knows this, sometimes there's a word that you just can't translate one for one. There's no good word for it. And so this word hesed, it occurs over 250 times in the Old Testament. And it's the word for God's covenant love, his loyal love. Sometimes it's translated faithfulness or loving kindness or mercy. And here's the beauty of it. In the middle of Joseph's life being the worst it's ever been, the hesed, love, loving kindness, mercy, goodness of God is with him even in that darkest place. And the hesed love of God has nothing to do with your circumstances. Just because things are going well doesn't mean that God's approving your life. Just because your circumstances aren't going well doesn't mean that God's disapproving of your life. And we want to base whether or not we feel God, whether or not God's with us on our circumstances. And the beauty of Joseph is that he's someone who suffers well. He's someone who suffers well so that even when things fall apart in his life, he's still experiencing the hesed love of God. And I want to be this kind of person in my life. I want to have this kind of connection in my story, that it's not just when things are going well that I'm experiencing God. In fact, if I'm honest, I would tell you the opposite. It was the times in my life that I felt the furthest from him that I experienced his love the most. And if you will reorient your gaze, you will find that the love of God, the covenant love, the loyal love, the strong love, it will guide you through the darkest moments of your life. And I know your brothers forgot about you and Potiphar forgot about you, but the Lord is with you in the pit. He's with you in the prison, and he will guide you through with his loyal love. He will. He'll guide you through, church. And if you're not careful, you'll let the cynicism and the despair of the prison rob you of the promise of God. And what Joseph doesn't see yet is the prison is the very place that's going to catapult him to the palace. But he doesn't see it yet. And so how you steward that prison, how you steward that moment is what positions us for the palace. You just got to see it. And I know you feel like God has given up on your dream. He's moved on. He's forgotten about it. But if you will fix your eyes on his loyal love. Listen, Joseph, it's better to be in the prison with God's hesed love than to be in Potiphar's house without it. See, we want to settle because it's easier. We want to settle because it's comfortable. And listen, you can have Potiphar's wife if you want. You can have Potiphar's house if you want. But find me in the prison with the hesed love of God. Don't settle, church. Don't settle for the easy route. Don't settle for the easy life. Do the hard things and find that his love sustains you. Now listen, we're gonna land this plane here. So here's what I want to say in closing. Here's what I want to say. As I was preparing this week, I felt this tension to wrap up Joseph's story all in one nice message for you. Because I didn't want to leave you on a sad note with Joseph in the prison. I wanted to get Joseph to the palace. There's some more dreams that happen. He reigns over Egypt. He's reconciled to his brothers. He ends up saving the whole nation from a famine. It's a crazy good story. But here's the thing with that. I want to leave you on a high note and promise you that victory's right around the corner. But guess what? That's not real life sometimes. Joseph was in prison and in Potiphar's house combined for 13 years. I wish I could stand up here and tell you today that if you just love Jesus well, you'll blink your eye, and the next week, the next month, you'll be in the palace with Pharaoh. But it's not real life. And we want to rush the process. We want to rush the prison. We want to rush Potiphar's house to get right to the fulfillment of the dream. God gives you a dream, it must be happening tomorrow. And turns out it's decades away. And there's a prison in between. And Potiphar's house is in between. And the pit is in between. And my message to you today, I would be doing you a disservice if all I did was bring you right to the palace with Joseph and told you that your breakthrough is right around the corner. And maybe it is. It's quite possible. But sometimes the hard, difficult challenges of life last years and decades. And my message to you today is not that if you love Jesus, everything will be fine. It's that in the places where you feel the most lost, he's still there. He's still with you. That he enters into our pain. He enters into our brokenness. And even in those places that are the darkest, that are the worst, I want you to know that even there, his hand will hold you. Even there, his eyes are on you. That his arm is not too short. His ears have not grown deaf. His eyes have not grown blind. And he's still with you, church. He suffers with us. He feels with us. In fact, that's what Christmas is all about. It's about God incarnate. You know what incarnate means, right? In flesh. That Jesus, when he came, he wasn't just pretending to be a human. He had a real body that really got tired and exhausted and hungry. He entered in the Joseph story. It's the Jesus story. Did you know the whole Bible is all about Jesus? He's the beloved Son, violently attacked, rejected by his own, traded for silver, given over to Gentiles, falsely accused, and raised up to the right hand of the King. That's the gospel, friend. And yet before we get to that big shouty moment where Joseph's restored, I want you to see here, this is what Christmas is all about. That he enters into our pain. He enters into our brokenness. The crazy thing about the risen Jesus appearing, he appears to Thomas. And what does Thomas say? Unless I see the marks in his hands, unless I put my hand into his side where he was pierced. And this is how you know, this is how Thomas knew that it was really Jesus who appeared to him. Because in the risen Jesus, God's new creation, there are scars in his hands and feet. There's a wound in his side. And I want you to know this morning that right now on the throne of creation is a king with scars still in his hands and feet. This is a God who knows pain. You've been rejected, Joseph, so was he. You've been attacked, Joseph, so was he. You've been accused, Joseph, so was he. Jesus, the eternal Son of God, the Logos, the Word, the one who made the world, God in flesh, believe it or not, scars in his hands and feet. This is a God who knows pain in his own body. This is a God who knows. Os Guinness said this: Christianity is the only religion whose God bears the scars of evil. You've never prayed to a Christ without scars. You've never worshiped a king without scars. You've been abused, he was too. You've been lied about, he was too. You've experienced grief, he has too. And he knows it. He feels it. He enters into our pain. Carl Jung has this concept in psychology of a wounded healer. And the idea of a wounded healer, he says, is that many people who go into the medical field or to therapy, they go into it because they've experienced some sort of trauma or pain themselves. And they found healing, and now they want to help other people experience healing as well. And he says in this concept that the best healers are those who have been wounded themselves because they know what it's like. And I want to tell you this morning that Jesus is the world's ultimate wounded healer. That he heals best because he's been wounded most.